I took a deep breath as I settled onto the couch, still trying to process the news my husband Jake had dropped on me earlier that day. A week-long business trip overseas. It wasn't unusual in his line of work, but this would be the first time I'd be alone in our house for such an extended period since we got married. The silence felt oppressive as I sipped my tea, my mind wandering to Jake's cheerful goodbye just hours ago. He had kissed me, promised to check in every night, and left with an excited gleam in his eye. I couldn't blame him for his enthusiasm. This was a big opportunity. But as the quiet of the empty house settled around me, I couldn't shake a nagging sense of unease. The first couple of days passed without much incident. I threw myself into my work-from-home routine, took long walks around the neighborhood to clear my head, and binge-watched a few shows I'd been meaning to catch up on. But by the third evening, the solitude was starting to wear on me. I was curled up on the couch with another cup of tea when the doorbell's chime cut through the silence, startling me. Frowning, I set my mug down and made my way to the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and a flutter of anxiety mixed with curiosity as I reached for the handle. To my surprise, I found myself face to face with Nick, Jake's best friend since their college days. He stood on the porch with an easy smile, a bottle of wine held casually in one hand. "Hey there," Nick said warmly. "I know Jake's out of town, and I thought you might like some company. Mind if I come in?" I blinked, momentarily taken aback. While Nick and I were certainly friendly, we'd never spent much time together one-on-one. He was always around Jake, and I realized I didn't know him as well as I probably should, given how close he was to my husband. "Oh, sure," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. "Thanks, you didn't have to do that." Nick shrugged as he entered. "Just being a good friend. Thought you might be going a little stir-crazy by now." As I closed the door behind him, I couldn't help but feel a small surge of gratitude. The house had felt so empty, and even if Nick wasn't who I'd expected, some company did sound nice. We settled in the living room, and Nick poured us each a glass of wine. The conversation started off a bit awkward, neither of us quite sure how to interact without Jake as a buffer, but as the wine flowed and we found common ground discussing mutual friends and Jake's trip, I found myself relaxing, to my surprise. The hours flew by. Nick was funnier than I remembered, his dry wit drawing genuine laughter from me for the first time in days. He was an attentive listener, too, and I found myself opening up about things I hadn't realized I needed to talk about. As the evening wore on, I became acutely aware of a shift in the atmosphere. Nick's gaze seemed to linger a bit longer than usual, and there was an intensity to his attention that felt different, not inappropriate, exactly, but definitely not the same casual friendliness I was used to. There was a moment brief, but undeniable, where the air between us seemed to crackle with an unexpected tension. Neither of us acknowledged it out loud, but I could feel my heart rate quicken. I quickly brushed it off as my imagination running wild, desperate to change the subject. "Wow, is that the time?" I said, glancing at the clock with exaggerated surprise. "I should probably get to bed. Early start tomorrow, and all that." Nick took the hint gracefully, thanking me for the company as he gathered his things. As I closed the door behind him, I leaned against it, letting out a long breath. What had just happened? And why did I feel so unsettled? Sleep didn't come easily that night. My mind kept replaying moments from the evening, analyzing every interaction. Was I reading too much into things? Nick was Jake's best friend, for heaven's sake. There was no way he'd ever think of crossing that line, right? But as I tossed and turned, I couldn't shake the memory of that charged moment, or the way Nick's eyes had seemed to see right through me. It wasn't supposed to feel like this, so confusing, so exhilarating. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were a jumbled mess of guilt and temptation, leaving me more exhausted than when I'd gone to bed. The next morning, I woke with a start, feeling disoriented and slightly hungover. As the fog of sleep cleared, the events of the previous night came rushing back, bringing with them a fresh wave of confusion and guilt. I went through my morning routine on autopilot, my mind continually drifting back to Nick. The way he'd listened so intently, how his laugh had made me feel warm inside. The unexpected spark I'd felt when our eyes met. It was ridiculous. I'd known Nick for years. Why was I suddenly seeing him in this new light? As I sipped my coffee, I tried to rationalize it. I was lonely, that was all. Jake had been gone for days, and I was latching onto the first bit of companionship that came my way. It didn't mean anything. It couldn't mean anything. But no matter how I tried to dismiss it, the memory of that charged moment kept creeping back in. The way the air had seemed to thicken between us, the unspoken possibility that had hung there for just a heartbeat. By mid-afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to talk to someone, to get this out of my head before it drove me crazy. Without really thinking it through, I found myself dialing my best friend, Zoe. "Hey, what's up?" Zoe's cheerful voice came through the speaker. I hesitated, suddenly unsure how to broach the subject. So, Nick came by last night. I started trying to keep my tone casual. "Nick? You mean Jake's friend, Nick?" Zoe's interest was immediately piqued. "What for?" I swallowed hard.
"Just to check in on me, I guess."
We had some wine, talked for a while. It was nice, but Zoe pressed when I trailed off. I let out a long sigh. "I don't know, Zoe. There was this moment. I can't really explain it. Nothing happened, but it felt like something." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "And what exactly did he do?" Zoe asked carefully. "That's just it," I replied, frustration creeping into my voice. "He didn't do anything, not really. It was more like a feeling. Like we were both aware of something we weren't supposed to be aware of. Does that make any sense?" Zoe hummed thoughtfully. "Well, that's complicated. I mean, he is Jake's best friend. Maybe it was just the wine talking?" Maybe I agreed half-heartedly, though deep down I wasn't convinced. After I hung up with Zoe, I tried to focus on work, on housework, on anything to keep my mind occupied. But thoughts of Nick seemed to lurk around every corner, impossible to escape. That evening, as I was picking at a lonely dinner, my phone buzzed with a text. My heart leapt into my throat when I saw it was from Nick. "I had a great time last night. Hope I didn't overstay my welcome." I stared at the message, my mind racing. How should I respond? What did this mean? After typing and deleting several replies, I finally settled on a simple, "Not at all. It was nice to have company." His response came quickly. "Glad to hear that. I was thinking of stopping by again tomorrow, if you're free." No pressure, of course. I felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to say no, to avoid whatever this was turning into. But another part, the part that had been lonely and bored for days, was sorely tempted. "It's just another friendly visit," I told myself. "Nothing is going to happen." Before I could overthink it any further, I typed back, "Sure, tomorrow works." As soon as I hit send, a mix of excitement and dread settled in my stomach. What was I doing? And more importantly, where was this going to lead? The next day passed in a blur of nervous energy. I couldn't focus on work, my mind constantly drifting to thoughts of Nick's impending visit. Was I setting myself up for something I couldn't control? Or was this all just in my head? As evening approached, I found myself fussing over my appearance more than usual. I changed outfits twice before settling on a casual but flattering ensemble. "It's just Nick," I reminded myself. "Jake's friend." But the butterflies in my stomach told a different story. The doorbell rang at 7 p.m. sharp. I took a deep breath, steeling myself before opening the door. Nick stood there, a warm smile on his face and a bag of takeout in his hand. "Hey," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "I thought you might appreciate a break from cooking." I felt a flutter in my chest at his thoughtfulness. "That's really sweet of you," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. "Thanks, Nick." We settled at the kitchen table, unpacking containers of aromatic Thai food. The conversation flowed easily, much like it had the other night. But this time, there was an undercurrent of tension, a charge in the air that hadn't been there before. I caught Nick staring at me a little longer than usual, and I felt my heart skip a beat. I quickly looked away, feeling the weight of guilt settle in my stomach. "This is ridiculous," I thought to myself. "He's Jake's friend. Nothing is going to happen." But the more I tried to push it aside, the more I felt drawn to the idea of letting something happen. And that was terrifying. As the evening wore on, it became clear that whatever had been brewing the night before was still there, simmering just beneath the surface. We danced around it with small talk and casual conversation, but the tension was undeniable. And then, without thinking, I found myself saying something I hadn't planned. Nick, do you ever wonder what would happen if we weren't tied to other people? He looked at me, surprised but not shocked. There was a pause, and then he answered, his voice quiet. I thought about it more than I should. I hadn't expected that. My heart raced, and I felt a strange mixture of excitement and panic. I'm sorry, I stammered.
I don't know why I said that.
Nick shook his head, his expression soft but serious. No, don't apologize. I've been feeling something too, but I don't want to ruin anything. You and Jake, that's sacred. His words hit me hard, and I realized how close we were to crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I nodded, feeling the gravity of the moment. Yeah, I whispered. I love Jake. Nick leaned back, exhaling deeply. I know and I respect that. But I won't lie, it's hard being around you sometimes. There's this connection that I can't ignore. For a long moment, we sat in silence, both of us contemplating the reality of what was happening. We had acknowledged something that neither of us wanted to, and now there was no going back. As Nick stood up to leave, he looked at me one last time. I should go before we make a mistake. I nodded, unable to speak, and watched as he walked out the door. The house felt even emptier after he left, and I was left to face the complicated mess of emotions swirling inside me. The next morning, I woke up feeling a sense of relief and dread all at once. A part of me was glad that we had come to our senses, but another part couldn't stop thinking about the depth of our conversation, about how close we had come to doing something that could shatter my marriage. Jake called me later that morning, checking in from his trip. His voice was warm and familiar, yet I couldn't shake the guilt that gnawed at me. I listened to him talk about his meetings, his coworkers, and how much he missed me. Each word felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. I found myself responding automatically, trying to sound upbeat and normal, but I was far from it. I felt like I was living in two worlds, one where I was Jake's loving wife, and another where Nick had stirred feelings I wasn't ready to confront. After hanging up with Jake, I decided I needed to clear the air with Nick. I didn't want things to be awkward, but I also needed to make sure we were both on the same page, that nothing had changed. With shaking hands, I dialed Nick's number. He answered on the third ring. Hey, I said, trying to sound casual. I just wanted to make sure we're okay, after last night. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Yeah, we're fine, he said, but his voice lacked the easygoing tone he usually had. Are you sure? I pressed. I don't want things to be weird between us. Nick sighed softly. Look, it's not weird, but I'm not going to lie. I think we need to be careful. Whatever this is, it's dangerous. For both of us. I knew he was right. I agree, I said. I don't want to mess things up. Neither do I, he replied. But it's hard, I've been thinking about you a lot more than I should. And I know that's wrong. Jake's my best friend, and you're his wife. His honesty was disarming, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. I had felt the same, and hearing him admit it out loud made everything more real. We have to stop this. Nick, I finally said, my voice firm. Whatever this is, it can't go any further. I love Jake, and I can't hurt him like that. Nick's voice softened. I know, I get it. I don't want to hurt him either. There was a long silence between us, the weight of the situation hanging in the air. I knew we had to put an end to this tension, to whatever had been building between us. But the more I tried to convince myself, the more I realized how hard it was going to be. After we hung up, I felt a strange sense of finality. It was the right decision, I told myself. Nick and I couldn't be anything more than friends, no matter what unspoken connection we might feel. But despite that, I couldn't shake the feeling of loss. Something had shifted between us, and there was no going back. The next few days passed in a blur. I threw myself into work, into keeping busy, anything to avoid thinking about Nick or the complicated emotions swirling inside me. Jake was due back in a couple of days, and I was determined to put all of this behind me before he returned. But things didn't go as planned. The day before Jake was supposed to come home, I got a text from Nick.
Can we talk?
My heart sank. I knew I shouldn't respond, but something in me couldn't resist. I couldn't leave things unresolved. Sure, I typed back, feeling a pit form in my stomach. That evening, Nick came over again. I had promised myself this would be the last time that we would have one final conversation to clear the air and then go back to our normal lives. But the moment he walked in, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. We sat on the couch, both of us avoiding eye contact for a while. The tension was palpable. "I'm sorry," Nick finally said, breaking the silence. "I shouldn't have texted you, I've been struggling with everything, and I didn't know what else to do."
I shook my head.
"It's not your fault. This whole thing just got out of hand. We should have never let it get this far." Nick looked at me, his expression serious. "I know, but I can't stop thinking about you. And that's the problem. I don't want to feel this way, but I do." I swallowed hard, feeling my own emotions rise to the surface. "We can't do this, Nick. It's not fair to Jake. It's not fair to either of us." He nodded slowly. "You're right. It's not fair. But it doesn't make it any easier." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of everything hung between us, unspoken but understood. I could feel the pull between us, the temptation to let something happen, to give in to whatever this was. But I knew that if we crossed that line, there would be no turning back. "I can't," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "I can't do this." Nick stood up, running a hand through his hair. "I know. I should go." But neither of us moved. We were both frozen in place, standing on the edge of a precipice we didn't want to fall into. Finally, Nick turned to leave, but before he reached the door, he stopped and looked back at me. "For what it's worth, I care about you. But I won't be the one to ruin your marriage." And with that, he was gone. As the door closed behind him, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. I had made the right choice, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like I had lost something important, something I hadn't even realized I wanted. The next day, Jake came home. As I heard his key turn in the lock, I felt a surge of conflicting emotions: relief at his return, guilt over my near indiscretion with Nick, and a lingering sadness I couldn't quite shake. "Honey, I'm home," Jake called out, his voice filled with warmth and excitement. I plastered on a smile and went to greet him, wrapping my arms around him in a tight embrace. The familiar scent of his cologne washed over me, and for a moment I felt grounded again. "I missed you so much," I murmured into his chest, willing myself to focus on the present, on the man I had chosen to spend my life with. Jake pulled back, grinning widely. "I missed you too. You wouldn't believe the week I've had." As he launched into stories about his trip, I found myself nodding and laughing at all the right moments. But there was a distance within me that I couldn't explain. I smiled at his jokes, asked questions about his meetings, and fell back into the rhythm of our life together. But something had changed. That night, as we lay in bed, Jake's arm draped over me, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. The guilt of my emotional affair with Nick weighed heavily on me. Should I tell Jake? Would it do more harm than good? I tossed and turned, grappling with my conscience. Days turned into weeks, and Nick and I didn't speak again after that night. We avoided each other, silently agreeing to let whatever had almost happened fade into the background. It was easier that way, safer. But the memory of those charged moments, the connection we'd shared, lingered in the back of my mind. I threw myself into my relationship with Jake with renewed vigor. I planned surprise date nights, initiated more intimate moments, and made a conscious effort to be more present in our conversations. Jake noticed the change, often commenting on how attentive I'd become. "What's gotten into you lately?" he asked one evening, a playful smile on his face. Not that I'm complaining, mind you. I forced a laugh, ignoring the twinge of guilt in my chest. "Just realized how much I missed you when you were gone," I replied, hoping he couldn't hear the slight tremor in my voice. As time passed, the acute pain of my near transgression with Nick began to dull. Life settled back into a comfortable routine, and I found myself able to breathe a little easier. But the experience had left its mark on me, a reminder of how easily the foundations of trust could be shaken. It was about 2 months after Jake's return when we received an invitation to a mutual friend's birthday party. As I scanned the guest list, my heart skipped a beat when I saw Nick's name. It would be the first time we'd be in the same room since our last encounter. On the night of the party, I spent an inordinate amount of time getting ready, vacillating between outfits and fussing with my hair. Jake raised an eyebrow at my indecisiveness, but didn't comment. As we entered the crowded party, my eyes immediately sought out Nick. He was across the room, engaged in conversation with a group of people. Our gazes met for a brief moment, and I felt a jolt of electricity run through me. I quickly looked away, focusing my attention on Jake as he led me to greet the birthday girl. Throughout the evening, I was hyper-aware of Nick's presence. We orbited each other carefully, never quite coming close enough to interact directly. The tension was palpable, at least to me, and I found myself drinking more than usual to calm my nerves. It wasn't until later in the night, when I stepped out onto the balcony for some fresh air, that we finally found ourselves alone together. "Hey," Nick said softly, joining me at the railing. "Hi," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. We stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the party muffled behind us. "How have you been?" he asked, his tone careful, neutral. I nodded, not quite meeting his eyes. "Good. Busy you?" "Same," he replied. Another pause. "Look, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry about everything. I hope we can still be friends for Jake's sake, if nothing else." I finally looked at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "I'd like that," I said, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. "I'm sorry, too."
For
"Everything." Nick gave me a small smile, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the easy friendship we'd once had. "We're okay," he said, and I knew he meant it. As we rejoined the party, I felt a sense of closure. The intense feelings, the confusion, the guilt, they were still there, but muted now, manageable. I found Jake in the crowd and slipped my hand into his, feeling a rush of affection for my husband. In the weeks that followed, life continued on. Nick remained a part of our social circle, but our interactions were cordial and appropriately distant. The charged energy between us had dissipated, replaced by a mutual understanding and respect for boundaries. One evening, as Jake and I were cleaning up after dinner, he surprised me with a question. "Hey, did something happen between you and Nick while I was away?" he asked casually, his eyes on the dish he was drying. I froze, my heart pounding. "What do you mean?" I managed to say, trying to keep my voice steady. Jake shrugged. "I don't know. You both just seemed a bit off at the party. I thought maybe you had a fight or something." I took a deep breath, weighing my options. In that moment, I made a decision. "Nick came over a couple of times while you were gone," I said slowly.
to check on me.
"We talked a lot, and I think we both realized we needed to be careful about boundaries. Nothing happened," I added quickly, "but it could have if we hadn't stopped it." Jake was quiet for a long moment, and I held my breath, waiting for his reaction. Finally, he put down the dish and turned to me. "Thank you for being honest with me," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I appreciate that, and I'm glad you both had the strength to do the right thing." I felt tears prick at my eyes, overwhelmed by his understanding. "I'm so sorry, Jake. I never meant to." He cut me off with a gentle kiss. "I know, we're okay. Just no more solo hangouts with Nick, all right?" I nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and love wash over me. "Of course. Never again." As we finished the dishes in comfortable silence, I reflected on the journey of the past few months. The temptation, the guilt, the near miss. It had all led to this moment of honesty and renewed commitment with Jake. I realized that while the connection I'd felt with Nick had been real, it paled in comparison to the deep, enduring love I shared with my husband. The experience had tested our relationship, but ultimately, it had made us stronger. As time passed, the memory of those charged moments with Nick faded, becoming nothing more than a cautionary tale, a reminder of the importance of trust and communication in a marriage. Jake and I grew closer, our bond deepened by the honesty we'd shared. Nick remained a part of our lives, but as a true friend to both of us, respectful of our relationship and the boundaries we'd established. The tension that had once simmered between us was gone, replaced by a genuine fondness and mutual respect. Looking back, I realized that the real story wasn't about the temptation I'd faced or the mistake I'd nearly made. It was about the choice I'd made to honor my commitment, to face my feelings honestly, and to nurture the relationship that truly mattered. In the end, it was a story of love tested and reaffirmed, of trust broken and rebuilt stronger than before. And as I looked at Jake, feeling the warmth of his love and the strength of our bond, I knew I'd made the right choice. The experience had left its mark, a reminder that even the strongest relationships require constant care and attention. But it had also shown me the depth of my love for Jake and the strength we possessed as a couple. As we moved forward, I carried with me the lessons learned from that tumultuous time, the importance of open communication, the value of trust, and the power of choosing love every day. These became the cornerstones of our relationship, guiding us through the challenges that life would inevitably bring. Years later, as Jake and I celebrated another anniversary, I looked back on that period with a mixture of gratitude and wisdom. The near miss with Nick had been a turning point, a moment that could have destroyed everything we'd built together. Instead, it had become the catalyst for a deeper, more honest connection between us. I squeezed Jake's hand, feeling a rush of love and appreciation for the man who had stood by me, who had chosen to trust and forgive. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I had made the right choice. The path of temptation may have glittered briefly, but it was nothing compared to the enduring warmth of the love we shared. As we raised our glasses to another year together, I silently renewed my commitment to our relationship. The challenges we'd faced had only made us stronger, and I looked forward to facing whatever the future held, hand in hand with the man I loved. In the end, our story wasn't about the temptations we'd faced or the mistakes we'd nearly made. It was about the choices we made every day to love, to trust, and to grow together. And as I looked into Jake's eyes, seeing the depth of his love reflected back at me, I knew that was the greatest story of all.